The morning heat at Clark Air Base was already rising when I stepped out of my Jeep on January 31st, 1945. The war was still raging across the Pacific, but here, on this sun-baked runway in Luzon, time seemed to stand still. I remember wiping the sweat from my neck and raising my camera, squinting through the lens at the shape that waited ahead. There she was, a Mitsubishi G4M. The Japanese called it the Type 1 attack bomber. We knew her by another name, the Betty. She sat there untouched, gleaming like a giant silver cigar resting quietly on the tarmac. For a moment I thought it must be some kind of trick. No holes, no burns, no shattered glass. Just a complete living machine that somehow no longer belonged to anyone. My name is Major Frank T. McCoy, Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific Area. I had spent the better part of 2 years crawling through the wreckage of Japanese aircraft scattered from New Guinea to the Philippines. Most were torn apart, burnt to skeletons, their secrets gone with the men who flew them. But this one, tail number 76312, was different. This bomber had been left behind by its crew during the American advance, still whole, still holding the story of its creation inside its metal skin. I remember circling her slowly, my boots crunching over bits of coral and gravel, the air thick with the smell of oil and old fuel. The tropical sun flashed off the wings, and I could see my own reflection bending across the aluminum panels. She was nearly 20 meters long, 25 from wingtip to wingtip, her lines smooth and graceful in a way that almost made you forget she was built for war. 2 radial engines, each rated at about 1,500 horsepower, hung silent, their propellers still, their cowlings streaked with dust. Everything about her seemed intact, too perfect, too deliberate. I'd seen captured Zeros before, even a few Valdive bombers, but never a Betty that hadn't been blasted from the sky. "This cannot be their standard design," I muttered to one of my men. "No Air Force would build a bomber this way." Yet as I climbed the ladder and peered into the fuselage, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The instinct that we were standing on the edge of discovery. Something that would rewrite what we thought we knew about Japan's war machines. We'd examined dozens of wrecks before, but nothing like this. Later, when I opened the inspection panels on her wings, I would finally understand why so many Japanese airmen had burned alive inside these aircraft. But at that moment, standing under the punishing Philippine sun, all I could think was that the enemy had just handed us a message, written in metal and fuel. When we finally opened the panels on that Betty's wings, the air filled with the metallic scent of heat and old fuel. I remember the sound of the screwdriver biting into the screws one by one until the aluminum sheet came free in my hands. The metal was thin, too thin. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt how fragile it was, barely 2 millimeters thick. I expected to see the dark rubber of a self-sealing tank, the kind every American bomber had used for years. Instead, there was nothing. Just empty metal space and the faint smell of gasoline trapped in the seams. I leaned closer, thinking maybe some layer had peeled away. But no, there was no armor, no rubber compound, no protective coating of any kind. Thousands of liters of high-octane fuel had been carried here, separated from enemy fire by nothing but this paper-thin shell. One of my engineers, a young lieutenant from Ohio, looked at me with disbelief. "Sir," he said quietly, "this can't be standard." I shook my head. "It is," I told him. "This whole wing is a coffin waiting to catch fire." I'd studied self-sealing tanks back home, how the rubber swelled when pierced, sealing holes in seconds, saving planes and men. Even our training aircraft had them. But this Betty, Japan's mainstay bomber, was flying combat missions without a single ounce of protection. I pressed my palm flat against the metal skin. The warmth from the sun seeped into it. But beneath that surface was the cold reality of what we were seeing. The design wasn't crude, it was deliberate. Every missing gram of armor meant more fuel, more range, and every drop of that extra range had been bought with the lives of Japanese crews. As the inspection continued, the realization settled in. The engineers and I weren't just studying a captured airplane. We were staring straight into the logic of an enemy that had chosen performance over survival. Their designers had gambled that speed and distance would keep them safe. It was a decision born from faith, not from experience. I remember closing my notebook and saying, almost to myself, "They built a weapon that kills its own men." The younger men around me fell silent. For them, it was a discovery. For me, it was something heavier, a glimpse into a nation's soul, stripped bare beneath aluminum wings. What we found that day wasn't a design flaw. It was a philosophy of war, one that believed victory was worth any cost, even the lives of every crew who took off in these machines. Standing there in 1945, I couldn't help but think back to the morning of December 8, 1941. Clark Field's darkest day. 4 years earlier, this same stretch of concrete had been a graveyard. I wasn't stationed here then, but every man in uniform remembered the stories. The air had been clear, the sun bright, and nobody expected the war to find them that fast. At 12:35 that afternoon, 82 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers appeared out of the blue, flying high at 20,000 feet, too high for our anti-aircraft guns to reach. They came in perfect formation, silent and disciplined, like a silver storm sliding across the sky. The first bombs hit the runways. Seconds later, the earth shook as entire rows of aircraft went up in fire. 17 B-17 flying fortresses sat wingtip to wingtip on the ground. 12 of them were gone within minutes. The rest were torn open by blast waves and shrapnel. Nearby, the P-40 fighters that could have met the attack never had the chance. They burned where they stood, ammunition cooking off in deafening pops. One surviving pilot, Lieutenant James Harrington, wrote later that it felt like hell opened its doors right over Luzon. He remembered watching those Bettys, untouched, banking away into the sunlight after the strike, flying smooth, proud, and impossibly far. Back then, we thought the Japanese had built the perfect bomber, long range, fast climb, flawless precision. We didn't know the cost. By the time the smoke cleared, Clark Field was nothing but twisted metal and scorched concrete. It was the day American air power in the Philippines ceased to exist. And now, 4 years later, I was standing in the same place, staring at the very kind of bomber that had started it all. The same type that once brought terror now sat abandoned and silent, the tropical wind whispering through its engines. The irony wasn't lost on me. In 41, those wings carried destruction. In 45, they carried truth. I ran my hand along the smooth fuselage, feeling the ghost of that first attack in the stillness of the field. So many men had died here believing these planes were unstoppable. Now I knew they were as fragile as paper lanterns. The difference between fear and understanding was only time and a war's worth of blood. The ghosts of Clark Field were still here, in the cracks of the runway and in the silence around us. The same sun beat down, but the meaning had changed. 4 years apart, the same ground told two stories, one that opened the war and one that revealed its truth. Just 2 days after the attack on Clark Field, the world witnessed something no one believed possible. On December 10, 1941, a formation of 26 G4M Betty bombers met the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya. I remember reading the first intelligence reports months later, long before I ever stood beside a captured Betty. Even on paper, it was hard to believe. The reports spoke of flawless coordination, Bettys flying low and steady, releasing their Type 91 torpedoes with near mathematical precision. Each torpedo weighed nearly 840 kilograms, carrying a warhead of over 200 kilograms of explosives, designed to run shallow so it could strike even in coastal waters. According to the British survivors, the sea itself seemed alive with silver streaks rushing toward them. Within minutes, the Prince of Wales, the pride of the Royal Navy, took 6 hits. Repulse, built during the First World War but modernised for this one, took at least 4. Witnesses described the sound as metal tearing underwater, followed by a violent roll as the great ships listed and began to die. In less than 2 hours, both vessels were gone. 841 British sailors lost to the sea. It was the first time in history that capital ships manoeuvring at sea, with guns firing in defence, had been sunk entirely by aircraft. No fleet had ever faced such humiliation. Reading those lines, I understood why pilots across the Pacific began calling the Betty the long-legged lady. She could fly farther than any bomber we had, reaching targets a 500 miles away and still returning home. That range gave Japan the illusion of invincibility. To the world, she seemed like a masterpiece of engineering, a weapon that could humble empires. And to be honest, I felt a strange mix of admiration and unease. Any machine capable of sinking a battleship from the sky deserved respect. But even then, buried between the glowing words of those intelligence summaries, there were details that troubled me. Notes about fires spreading too easily after enemy hits, about crews never returning. Those details didn't fit the legend. They hinted at something fragile hidden inside all that reach and power. Years later, when I placed my hand on the thin metal skin of the Betty at Clark Field, those reports came flooding back. The aircraft that had once rewritten naval warfare now looked delicate, almost defenseless. Yes, she had long legs, but nobody, not even her creators, truly understood the price they had paid for that range. In early 1942, the name Betty carried a weight that every Allied pilot understood. By then, I was part of the growing network of intelligence officers collecting fragments of reports from every corner of the Pacific. Each morning a new file crossed my desk, and each one told the same story. Another base hit, another convoy bombed. It became a grim rhythm. The Betty seemed to be everywhere at once. They struck Darwin from bases 1,500 miles away, dropping bombs on the Australian coast like it was their own backyard. They hit Port Moresby again and again, crossing the New Guinea mountains as if those jagged peaks were nothing more than ripples on a map. They reached all the way to Guadalcanal from Rabaul, 600 miles over open sea, with precision and coordination that left our analysts shaking their heads. The reports came in so fast we stopped reacting with surprise. Every line was a reminder that Japan's air power wasn't just strong, it was far-reaching, relentless, and impossible to predict. The G4M's range gave the Japanese Empire something we didn't yet have: flexibility. They could hit us from beyond the range of our fighters, strike at dawn, and vanish into the horizon before a single American engine could start. For 6 long months, the Pacific belonged to the Betty. Every island outpost, every harbour, every moving ship felt its shadow. Even when we couldn't see them, we could feel them, the hum of their twin engines somewhere beyond the clouds. I remember reading one field report from New Guinea where a forward observer simply wrote, "They come from nowhere, and they never miss." There was admiration in that fear. We respected the engineering that made such reach possible, even as it bled us dry. At that stage, nobody knew the truth hiding behind those long wings and clean lines. To our eyes, the Betty looked invincible, the perfect weapon for an empire stretching across the Pacific. Every Allied crewman who faced them could testify to their reach and their accuracy. But none of us, not even the men who studied their wrecks, could imagine how fragile that power really was. Back then we measured them by what they could destroy, not by what they lacked inside. Looking back now, I realise that was the cruelest illusion of all. The Betty's greatness was built on the same thing that would one day destroy it. No one at the time could have known that inside that elegant, far-flying bomber lay the seed of its own undoing. By August of 1942, the war had turned, though we didn't realise it at first. Reports from Guadalcanal began to sound different, less like fear and more like surprise. On August 8th, 23 G4M Betty bombers from Rabaul took off to strike our newly built airfields on the island. Only 5 made it back. 18 were shot down in a single mission. About 120 airmen lost in one afternoon. I remember reading the first combat summaries from the fighter squadrons. The pilots almost couldn't believe what they had seen. "They go up like torches," one of them wrote. "Hit them anywhere. Wings, fuselage. It doesn't matter. They explode." Another pilot called them flying cigars. The name spread fast through every fighter group in the Pacific, along with another nickname that carried a darker kind of humour: the one-shot lighter. It wasn't bravado, it was disbelief. These were the same bombers that had terrorised the skies months earlier, the same ones that had outrun interceptors and sunk warships. Now they were burning like paper lanterns. As an intelligence officer, I saw the reports before they reached the newspapers. The tone was clinical: positions, altitudes, gun calibers, but between the lines, I could feel the astonishment. Pilots described debris raining into the sea, wings breaking apart mid-air, and bodies falling through fire. Some wrote about the smell of fuel and smoke that hung in the air long after the fight ended. For me, those weren't just words, they were data points. And yet, even through the cold lens of analysis, I felt a strange unease. Something in the numbers didn't add up. No aircraft should ignite that easily. Even our lightest fighters could take several hits before catching fire. But the Betty seemed to erupt from a single burst. I started collecting field photos from wreck sites. Charred aluminum twisted like tin foil, nothing left of the wings but blackened ribs. The report said some crews never even had time to bail out. It was as if the aircraft themselves were built to burn. The Japanese kept sending them, mission after mission, losing more each time. The skies that once belonged to the Betty were now turning against her. We didn't yet understand why. None of us did. We only knew that somewhere in that sleek design was a flaw, something fatal that no pilot could survive. I wouldn't learn the truth until 3 years later, standing under the Philippine sun, when I ran my hand along the bare metal wing of a captured Betty and realised what those pilots had been fighting all along. The first real clue came from the Australian engineers who reached Buna in late 1942. They had captured a half-burned airfield littered with wrecks, Zeros, Nels, and a few Bettys that had been abandoned when the Japanese withdrew. The photographs they sent to us in the Southwest Pacific Intelligence Office looked ordinary at first. Twisted metal, shattered canopies, bits of propeller scattered like bones. But in the margins of the report, one handwritten note caught my eye. No self-sealing tanks observed. It seemed trivial at the time. I remember thinking, that can't be right. Every combat aircraft in the world used self-sealing tanks by 1942. The Australians must have missed the inner layers, or mistaken battle damage for stripped material. I even wrote a remark in my own file, possibly scavenged by retreating crews for rubber recovery. That explanation made sense then. Rubber was scarce, and the Japanese recycled everything they could. But the reports kept coming. Within weeks, more wreck analyses arrived, from Milne Bay, from Lae, from New Guinea's northern coast. Each one carried the same quiet verdict: no self-sealing compound. The wording never changed. Different handwriting, different inspection teams, same conclusion. I started to feel uneasy. Either the Japanese were suffering catastrophic material shortages across every front, or we were looking at a deliberate pattern. I pulled the field photos into my office lightbox and examined them closely. You could see the exposed metal tanks right under the torn skin of the wings, thin, bright, and completely unprotected. I remember tracing the outlines with a pencil on the glass, trying to imagine what the engineers were thinking when they built them that way. There was no sign of armour plating, no fire suppression piping, not even residue from sealant compound. It wasn't neglect, it was design. Still, I hesitated to draw conclusions. We'd seen so many desperate improvisations from the Japanese by that point. Wooden rudders, patched fuselages, stripped-down cockpits to save weight. Maybe this was just another stopgap, but the deeper we looked, the harder it was to dismiss. Every captured Betty told the same story. The fuel system was exactly the same. 8 tanks, no protection, nothing between the fuel and enemy gunfire but a paper-thin shell of aluminum. By the time the 5th report arrived with identical findings, I stopped doubting. I called it into my superiors, but even they hesitated to believe it. They wouldn't send crews to war in something that fragile, one colonel said. I wanted to believe that too, but in my gut I knew the truth was stranger and darker than any of us expected. We were beginning to understand this wasn't an oversight, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. At Clark Field we finally had the chance to take one apart properly. The Betty sat in the hangar like a ghost from another world, her silver skin dulled by dust but her structure nearly perfect. For 3 weeks, my team and I dismantled her piece by piece, panel by panel, rivet by rivet. Every morning we arrived before sunrise, notebooks in hand, cameras ready, careful not to damage what might be the only intact example in Allied hands. We started with the wings. Each section came away clean, revealing the heart of her design, the fuel system. 8 tanks in all, 4 in each wing, arranged in pairs along the spar. The total capacity was 4,180 litres of high-octane fuel, more than 1,200 gallons, enough to carry her more than 3,700 miles. But the shocking part wasn't how much fuel she could hold, it was how little stood between that fuel and death. The tanks were bare aluminum, no self-sealing compound, no fire suppression lines, not even insulation. We measured the skin thickness, 2 millimeters, maybe less in some places. 2 millimeters of metal, thinner than a coin, stood between the crew and an inferno. I ran my hand along the inside of one of the tanks, the smooth surface still faintly smelling of gasoline. "This is their armour," I said quietly. One of my men, a former B-24 mechanic, just shook his head. A .30 caliber round would go straight through both sides, he muttered. And he was right. We compared the data with our own aircraft. A B-17 Flying Fortress weighed over 16,000 kilograms empty, nearly double the Betty's 6-700, but that extra weight meant layers of protection, self-sealing tanks, armoured bulkheads, firewalls, redundant fuel lines. Even our fighters carried more protection than this bomber. The Japanese had traded every ounce of safety for range. The math was cruelly simple. By eliminating armour and self-sealing systems, they saved nearly 500 kilograms, weight that could instead be used for fuel. Range gained, lives lost. As we removed each tank, documenting every measurement, I began to feel the same chill I'd felt reading those Guadalcanal reports. I could almost see it now. The moment a bullet struck, the fuel spraying, the vapour igniting, the sky turning orange. Every hole in those wings was a death sentence. Every mission was a gamble against physics itself. By the end of the third week, our notes filled a binder thicker than my hand, but the conclusion was already clear. This wasn't carelessness or ignorance. It was precision, a deliberate engineering decision made years earlier in pursuit of performance. When I looked at those thin tanks lying empty on the hangar floor, I couldn't stop thinking about the men who'd flown with them full. And at last, the numbers made sense. We finally understood why a single mission at Guadalcanal had claimed 120 lives in an afternoon. After the war, when the archives finally opened and the captured documents came across my desk, I began to see the origins of everything we had found at Clark Field. The mystery of the Betty's thin skin didn't start in a factory. It began 8 years earlier in 1937, inside a quiet conference room of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Among the files was a typewritten sheet, labelled Specification Nabitdas Attack Bomber Requirements. The numbers were astonishing even by peacetime standards, a range of 4,700 kilometres, a top speed of 398 kilometres per hour, and a bomb or torpedo load of 800 kilograms. It was the kind of request that could only have come from admirals who didn't understand physics, or who refused to accept its limits. No bomber in any country at that time could come close to those figures. The B-17 hadn't even flown yet, and our own designs could barely reach half that range. But for Japan, an island empire with ambitions that stretched across the Pacific, distance was everything. They needed a bomber that could strike from Formosa to the Philippines, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, from the home islands to the edges of Asia, and back again without refueling. Reading through the memos, I could almost hear the conversation between engineer and admiral. Make it faster, make it lighter, make it fly farther. No mention of armour or survivability or crew protection. Those words simply weren't part of the language. The men who wrote that document weren't designing a balanced aircraft. They were designing an idea, a weapon that could make geography itself irrelevant. In their minds, the bomber's range would replace an aircraft carrier's deck. Its speed would outfly danger, and its endurance would hold together an empire stretched thin across the sea. But numbers have a cruel way of turning against their makers. Every kilometre of range demanded more fuel. Every litre of fuel added weight, and every kilogram saved to make room for that fuel had to come from somewhere. Protection was the first to go. The armour was deleted, the self-sealing tanks abandoned, the safety redundancies stripped away. The engineers did exactly what they were told. They achieved the impossible by removing everything that made survival possible. I stared at those papers for a long time, imagining the pride in those meetings when the prototype finally met its goals. On paper it must have looked perfect. 4,700 kilometres of reach, 398 kilometres per hour of speed, 800 kilograms of payload. But looking at it through the eyes of 1945, I could only shake my head. It was a design written in strategic illusion, not in engineering truth. They hadn't built an airplane, they had built a mistaken belief, forged from ambition and destined for fire. Among the captured files that crossed my desk after the war, one report stood out, the intelligence profile of the man who had built the Betty. His name was Kiro Honjo, chief designer at Mitsubishi, the engineer who turned the Navy's impossible wish list into a flying reality. The report described him as meticulous, disciplined, educated in Germany during the early 1930s. He had studied under the engineers at Junkers, absorbed their methods, and brought home a mind sharpened by European precision. I remember sitting in my tent one evening, reading through those pages under the dim light of a lantern. His sketches were clean, mathematical, every curve justified by a formula. He wasn't reckless, he was deliberate. He was no fool, I murmured to myself. Honjo had seen the same numbers we did. He understood weight, drag, range, and thrust better than most of us. He must have known what removing armour and self-sealing tanks would mean, and yet he did it anyway. In his calculations, range equaled life, not for the crew, but for the nation. The Betty could fly farther, hit deeper, and support Japan's dream of an empire that spanned the Pacific. Survival, at least for the men inside, wasn't part of the equation. As I read, I could almost respect the clarity of his logic. The Japanese needed reach, and he gave it to them. The numbers worked. The aircraft performed exactly as required. It flew faster, longer, higher than anything of its kind when it debuted. But in solving the problem of distance, Honjo had created another, one that consumed his own pilots by the hundreds. In the math of war, he chose the longer line and erased his own men with it. I kept picturing him, standing beside the first prototype at Nagoya in 1939, watching it take off with pride. I wondered if he knew then what those numbers would cost. Perhaps he told himself that range would protect them, that the enemy would never reach them, or perhaps he simply believed that the mission mattered more than the men. Either way, the result was the same. Every calculation that made the Betty a marvel of engineering also made it a death trap. I felt a strange, bitter respect for the man, an admiration for his skill, and a sorrow for the blindness that came with it. Honjo didn't build a failure. He built perfection for the wrong purpose. The Betty did exactly what it was designed to do, and that was the tragedy. I understood him. I truly did. He was an engineer caught between science and faith, between what could be built and what should never be built. I understood him, but I could not forgive him. The proof of everything we had discovered wasn't found in blueprints or engineering notes, it was written across the Pacific sky. The first came on April 18th, 1943. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville aboard a G4M Betty when 18 P-38 Lightnings were sent to intercept him. They flew 400 miles at wavetop height to reach the exact point at the exact minute his plane would arrive. When they found him, 2 Bettys and 6 Zero escorts were cutting across the jungle coast. Captain Rex Barber opened fire. A few bursts tore through the wing of Yamamoto's bomber, and within seconds it turned into a ball of fire. It fell burning into the jungle, and with it went the man who had started the war. The second Betty went down the same way, hit once, then gone in an instant. The American pilots called it clean shooting, but I saw it differently. It was the inevitable consequence of design. No armour, no ceiling, no chance. Every round that touched a Betty ignited the sky. 2 years later, I saw the same story play out again, only worse. March 21st, 1945. 18 G4Ms lifted off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an Oka rocket-powered suicide glider under its belly. The plan was to fly within 20 kilometres of our fleet off Okinawa, release the Okas, and let their pilots dive at our ships. But the Bettys never made it. Radar picked them up 100 miles out, and F-6F Hellcats from the USS Hornet climbed to meet them. The Bettys were slow, weighed down by the Okas, unable to manoeuvre. One after another they went up in flames. Not a single bomber reached launch range. 137 crewmen and 15 Oka pilots died in less than 10 minutes. I've seen the photos, the smoke plumes stretching across the sea like black fingers. It wasn't battle anymore, it was execution. They died before they ever reached their targets. And for what? For an airplane built to fly farther than any other, but never built to come home. 6,000 kilometres of range meant nothing when you couldn't survive the last 100. That was the terrible irony of Honjo's genius. His design worked perfectly. It just worked against its own men. Whenever I looked at the analysis photos from those wrecks, the charred wings, the molten tanks, the twisted fuselages, I felt the same chill I had the day I first opened the Clarkfield Betty. The numbers had been right, the performance extraordinary, but all of it was for nothing. In the end, the Betty had done exactly what it was made to do, burn beautifully and die quickly. August 19th, 1945. I remember the report arriving on my desk like a whisper. 2 G4M Betty bombers, repainted entirely in white, their bodies stripped of guns, their wings marked with wide green crosses. They were to fly from Atsugi to Iejima, carrying Japan's surrender delegation to meet Allied officers. The irony was almost unbearable. The same bomber that had opened the Pacific War by burning Clark Field was now carrying surrender papers across the same sky. They took off at dawn, escorted not by Zero fighters but by American P-38s and F-6Fs. Their mission no longer war but peace. The Americans called them Baton 1 and Baton 2, call signs that deliberately echoed Bataan, the place where so many of our men had fallen 3 years earlier. I saw the reconnaissance photographs later that week. The Bettys gleamed like ghosts against the morning clouds, flying in perfect formation, flanked by their former enemies. There were no tracers, no contrails of pursuit, only stillness. For the first time in the war, the sky over the Pacific was silent. The crews wore dress uniforms, not flight gear. The bomb bays were empty. The wings that once carried torpedoes now carried nothing but air. When they landed at Iejima, American personnel guided them in with flare signals. No shouting, no suspicion. Just quiet understanding. Those men stepped out carrying briefcases, not sidearms. Their faces were pale, their eyes fixed ahead, and for a moment even the Americans didn't cheer. It was as if everyone knew they were watching the closing of a circle. The first air raid of the war and the first gesture of peace had come from the same machine. I remember staring at one photograph, a white Betty sitting on the runway, the green cross faintly visible against the glare. The paint was fresh, but beneath it, I could still trace the outlines of where the guns had been. To me, that image said everything. The Betty had finally completed her last mission, not to destroy but to surrender. No fuel, no bombs, no anger left in those wings, only silence, shame, and something close to peace. After the war ended, I spent months surrounded by numbers, endless columns of figures that turned human lives into arithmetic. The final production tally for the G4M Betty came to 2,414 aircraft across all variants. Some sources listed slightly more, others slightly less, depending on how they counted prototypes and transports. But the meaning was the same. Of those more than 2,000 bombers built, barely a handful survived the war intact. Over 2,000 were destroyed in combat, and with them, nearly every man who ever flew one. We estimated the survival rate for Betty crews at less than 10%. Most didn't even have a chance to bail out. The reports from recovered crash sites read like epitaphs. No survivors, aircraft burned completely, remains unidentifiable. I used to think of planes as machines, but reading those words again and again, they became something else. Tombs with wings. I compared the figures with our own losses. The United States had produced over 12,000 B-17s, nearly 10,000 B-24s, and thousands more B-25s. They too had been shot down in terrible numbers, but the difference was stark. Crews from damaged B-17s and B-24s often made it home. Sometimes half of them bailed out and lived to fly again. The Betty offered no such mercy. One hit, one spark, and the whole crew vanished in fire. In raw numbers, Japan had built a bomber with extraordinary reach, but in human cost it was the most expensive aircraft ever made. As I compiled my final report, I wrote a line I still remember. We counted them not by airframes, but by lives. That sentence haunted me. It still does. I thought of the young men who climbed into those shining fuselages believing in duty, believing their machines would carry them safely home. Instead, they carried their own funeral pyres into the sky. The irony was bitter. The Betty was proof that performance without protection is suicide disguised as success. The Japanese engineers had optimized every number, speed, range, payload, but they had forgotten the only figure that mattered. How many men would live to see another sunrise? In the cold logic of engineering, the design made sense. In the warmth of humanity, it was madness. When I finished the last page of my analysis, I closed the folder and sat in silence. The numbers no longer looked like statistics, they looked like ghosts. Years after the war, I found myself standing in front of what was left of her, a single wing from a G4M Betty, resting quietly inside the Smithsonian's collection warehouse. The metal had dulled with age, the rivets lined like scars along its surface. I reached out and ran my hand across it. Just as I had done on the runway at Clark Field in 1945, it felt the same, thin, fragile, and impossibly light. Back then, I had seen it as evidence. Now it was something else. A relic, not just of a machine, but of a philosophy. I had spent years studying those numbers, those reports, those wrecks, and the conclusion had never changed. The Betty wasn't the result of bad engineering. It was perfect engineering for a doomed idea. Every calculation, every decision, every piece of metal had been shaped around a single belief, that range and speed could replace protection, that courage could replace armor, that dying beautifully was the same as winning. That belief built an empire of ashes. When I looked at that wing, I saw the two faces of the war staring back at each other. On one side, our B-17s and B-24s, heavy, armoured, designed to bring men home. On the other, the Betty, elegant, stripped bare, built to go farther even if it never came back. Two nations, two philosophies, one valuing endurance, the other sacrifice. We both reached for the sky, but we reached for different heavens. The Japanese built aircraft that demanded their pilots die well. We built aircraft that gave ours a chance to live again. That difference, more than tactics, more than industry, was the line that decided the war, and it was thin, like the aluminum beneath my fingertips. Standing there in that quiet hall, surrounded by artifacts that once shook the world, I realized how close genius and tragedy can live within the same design. Kira Honjo and his engineers had built something extraordinary, and in doing so, they proved that brilliance without humanity is just another form of madness. I looked once more at the wing's smooth surface, catching the dim reflection of my hand upon it. It felt cold, but not dead, more like the echo of a heartbeat long silenced. That day in 45, when I touched that thin aluminum skin, I wasn't just feeling metal, I was touching the line between brilliance and madness.